Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our beach nesting bird volunteer training. We're just going to give it about a minute to let people join, and then we'll get started. And just a quick FYI for all, we are recording this session so that if somebody missed it, or if you all want to go back and reference it later on, we are going to get this up on YouTube. But if you don't want to be seen, then make sure you hide your video. So like I said, we're going to give it about 30 more seconds, and then we will dive on in. And welcome, everybody.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to say that my name shows as Antonio Velez, but I'm Sandra. I'm just using my boyfriend's computer right now. So just to clarify that, I'm Sandra.
Hey, Sandra.
Hi, good morning.
Thanks for listening in.
Thank you.
For everyone, Sandra is one of our seasonal folks that's going to be helping out early season. So thanks for making the time to listen in.
No worries. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll get started. So once again, I want to welcome everybody to our beach nesting bird volunteer training. This is a training that's being put on by the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds, which is a partnership between Audubon, Connecticut and the Connecticut Audubon Society, with also the Nature Conservancy, that assists the state of Connecticut and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the monitoring and stewardship of our beach nesting birds, primarily piping plover, American oystercatcher, and least tern, although we do have common tern and black skimmers in some years as well. Just a quick, I'm going to share the agenda really quick. I'm having trouble advancing my slide. There we go. So we've got a lot on the agenda this morning. We're going to be starting with an introduction of our leaders. We'll kind of just all go around and introduce ourselves, the staff. And then Laura Saucier from the State of Connecticut Wildlife Division is going to talk briefly about law enforcement and being a good witness. Then she will give a deep dive into piping plover natural history, shorebird management practices, and what's involved in fieldwork. Then I'll be talking about the natural history of the American oystercatcher and reporting banded birds. Then Scott, who's our veteran volunteer coordinator of 10 years, will be talking about scheduling and data reporting, and then we will open it up in the end for questions. We are going to, as I mentioned already, but I'm going to say it one more time, we are recording this webinar so that, for folks who missed it, there'll be an opportunity to still participate. And, for all of you, if you have, want to go back and see parts of it again, this will eventually go up on our CT Waterbirds blogspot webpage, so you'll be able to access it there. Anyways, if you don't want people to see your view, you can kind of hide your view so it's not seen in the recording. And lastly, I know we're all pretty used to using Zoom at this point, or other sort of online webinar platforms, but just in case this is new to anybody, at the top of the screen you'll see the words View Options, and under this heading you can hide your video panel or click side-by-side mode. And either of these will ensure that your view of the PowerPoint isn't obstructed by the view of people or the view of the chat. Also, you can switch between speaker view, which is sort of just seeing the person who's speaking at any given moment, or grid view, which is sort of seeing all participants. And you can enter and exit full screen mode. Two other things: at the bottom of the screen, you will see a chat button. And what I'd like everybody to do right now is to click on that chat button and type your name into the chat so that we have a sort of good attendance list for this morning. And then also during the presentations, we're gonna ask people to, if you have a question, please go ahead and type it in the chat. Both Sophie and Beth are standing by to answer questions in the chat. And any questions that we can't answer in the chat, what we're gonna do is kind of take note of them and hold off until the end, and then we'll answer all questions at the end. Similarly, at the end of today's presentations, if you have another question and you want to sort of ask it yourself, you can click the reaction button and you can actually raise your hand or it'll be a button to raise your hand, and then we can, unmute you and kind of give you the opportunity to ask your question live as well. This webinar is scheduled from 10:30 to 12, but we are willing to stay on for a bit after 12 to answer additional questions. So I want to just thank you all for joining again today. And let's do our quick round of introductions. So I'll start with myself. My name is Corey Folsom O'Keefe. I'm the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, Connecticut, and I'm thrilled to see so many new volunteers here today. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Patrick Cummins. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society. I want to thank all of you, especially those of you who are Connecticut Audubon members. We're a proud member of the Audubon Alliance, and we're looking forward to this season. Thank you.
So my name is Scott Krupash. You have probably already spoken with me if you've emailed ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. I am the volunteer coordinator, and we are all in the 10th season of doing this. We have done a great job with Connecticut Audubon Society and Audubon Connecticut, plus our partners at Deep Wildlife Division and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And currently I am working on this through my business, Scott Krupash Photography, as an independent contractor through Audubon Connecticut, though in the past you may have known me for working for Connecticut Audubon Society or Audubon Connecticut or otherwise. So I've been all over the place, but here I am now.
We're glad to have you, Scott.
Thanks, Corey.
Hi, I'm Martha Rice. I'm the volunteer coordinator with the Nature Conservancy. Happy to see you all and thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Sophie Duncan. I'm a land steward with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm super excited about shorebird monitoring this year.
So hi, I'm Beth Amendola. I'm the Coastal Program Coordinator for Audubon, Connecticut. And myself and Sophie are going to be answering questions in the chat, as Corey mentioned. So feel free to just put anything in there whenever you have a question. And those we can't answer right away, we will hold till the end of the presentation and bring them back up. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Saucier. I'm a wildlife biologist for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's Wildlife Division. And I'm happy to see so many new faces here today to help us out with our shorebird monitoring. Welcome.
Okay, so Laura, if you want to start sharing your presentation, take it away.
Okay, let me rearrange my screen a wee bit. There we go. Okay. All right. So again, my name is Laura Saucier, and my part of today is to teach you about piping plovers and least terns. In the agenda, I was supposed to talk to you about being a good witness, but I've actually flip-flopped that towards the end of my presentation so that it makes a little bit more, maybe more sense moving forward. So if you haven't muted yourself, if you wouldn't mind doing that, that would be great. And all right, so what I'm going to go over today is pretty much the life history management and how we monitor piping plovers and least terns in Connecticut. So that's kind of a quick breakdown of my presentation. My presentation is a little lengthy. I apologize. I never know if people are going, if I've got experienced birders here or people who have never seen a plover before. So I will err on the side of caution. So this right here is a piping plover. And I'm going to talk a lot about this fella here. So why are we here? Why do we care? The piping plover is a species that's included on the federal endangered species list. It was added on that list in 1986. Now, this bird has two distinct populations. There's one that breeds on the Atlantic coast from the Maritimes, Canada, all the way south to North Carolina. And then there's this separate, we think separate population that nests on the Great Lakes and on some of the sandy shores of some larger rivers in the Midwest. And it's not clear as to whether or not these two groups or populations, if they intermingle or not. There's still a lot we don't know about this bird. So this bird is also on our Connecticut Endangered Species list as a threatened species. It was added in 1992 at the inception of our Endangered Species Act, our State Endangered Species Act. So when you look in the literature, piping plovers was, air quotes, once a common summer visitor to Connecticut. So that makes us think that it was fairly prevalent here years ago. Now, this species was added to, both of these lists for three primary reasons. One of the biggest reasons that is no longer a reason, but this bird was heavily harvested for the hat making industry back in the 1800s when ladies' hats with bird feathers were all the rage. Those bird feathers came from unregulated harvest of shorebirds, egrets, you name it. Since we now have pretty robust fish and wildlife laws pertaining to harvesting of these critters, that is not really an issue anymore. The current challenges that we continue to have issues with are shoreline development and human disturbance. And when I say shoreline development, I'm thinking of buildings built right up against dunes, or where dunes might have been, we now have lots and lots of houses or warehouses or what have you. So this is permanent loss of shoreline, of dune habitat. And this human disturbance I will discuss ad nauseum at length in a couple minutes. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which again is the agency that oversees fish and wildlife laws in the United States, they would consider piping plovers to be, their population to be recovered if in the Northeast here we could sustain 600 breeding pairs. So that we kind of have a goal in mind when talking about piping plovers. So Connecticut's part of that 600 pairs is about 40 pairs. If Connecticut can sustain about 40 breeding pairs, we're doing all right. Our 10-year average has been 53 pairs, which is great. So a little bit about the Endangered Species Act for those folks who have never heard of it or know little about it. The purpose of it is to protect and recover imperiled species and their ecosystems. So for every species that is deemed where populations have declined to a point where the Fish and Wildlife Service is concerned, they write a recovery plan for every species that's on that list, which is basically a cookbook for recovery. And within that plan, it talks about the term take, which if you hear us talking about take is the unlawful, well, I have it defined here. Take is to harass, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or any attempt to do so. And the Endangered Species Act is such that it aims to prevent take of a species. So while it's a federal act, it does have some limitations and limited authority on private property. So my agency, DEP, we work with other state agencies, towns, landowners, federal agencies, volunteers, academics, non-governmental organizations, et cetera, to protect endangered species where they occur in our state. So piping plovers and least terns here in Connecticut. Connecticut has approximately 80 miles of open sandy beach habitat. That habitat inherently is narrow, it's fragmented, and it's highly developed in our state. And it is also intensively utilized. There are many different user groups competing for beaches. So the piping plover breeds on those beaches. Now, the birds are arriving as we speak. They usually get here mid-March. We've had a few sightings of some. So they spend their summer here in Connecticut, but they overwinter. They migrate south, and they'll spend their winters in South Carolina or around the Gulf Coast or down in the Bahamas. So when they return here, they're looking for sandy beach habitat. They've evolved to nest on this habitat and forage in this habitat. The males and females do have different plumages. The males have a little bit darker of a neck collar, like you see, like those dark black, those dark feathers around its neck. The males have their collars a little bit darker typically. And sometimes, honestly, but there is variation. The females tend to have are a little bit lighter. Their darker markings are a little bit lighter. And to be honest, sometimes if they're not paired up, I sometimes have a hard time telling which sex is which. But you'll see that on your own as you do your monitoring. So in this picture here, I've got a big red circle, and there's a piping plover right in the middle of it. So you see at the bottom of that photo, you see some rack line, which is basically any vegetation or whatever that gets washed up by the tide creates like a line in the sand. Now, piping plovers nest between that heavy beach grass that you see at the top of the photo and that rack line that you see at the bottom of the photo. That red circle, or oval, I should say, with the piping plover in the middle, that is prime piping plover nesting habitat. And they will begin to start nesting next month. So when you think of bird nests, you know, I grew up in the suburbs. So to me, a nest was like a robin's nest. It was a cup of interwoven grasses. Well, piping plover's nests look nothing like that. It's essentially a small depression in the sand that the males will create, and females will lay 4 eggs in that little depression. Sometimes you get the birds will line the nest cup, if you will, with little bits of shell, but not always. But the main point of this is that the birds lay 4 eggs, and those eggs are essentially sand colored. They're incredibly cryptic. This is, an evolutionary strategy for this species to avoid predation of their eggs. If their eggs look like sand, it's going to be a lot harder for a predator to find them. Now, incubation. So male and female piping plovers take turns incubating their eggs. They will delay their incubation until the female has laid all 4 eggs. And every once in a while you get nests that aren't, nothing is sometimes you get nests with 3 eggs, sometimes you get nests with 5 eggs. But in general, it's 4 eggs. And the parents wait until that last egg is laid, and then they begin incubating full time. Again, those duties are shared by the pair. And if all goes right, if those birds are able to settle down and incubate well, those eggs will hatch in 27 days. So after they hatch in 27 days, you get these super cute chicks there. And they are precocial, which basically means if you like horses, they're kind of like horses. Once they're born, they dry off and they're up and walking around and feeding with their parents. And these chicks will stay with their parents or a parent until migration. So they have like little family units that as you do your monitoring, you're going to come to recognize and know. And then it takes about 28 days, give or take, for these little chicks to fly. And the term we use for the ability to fly is fledge. So if you hear me talk about birds fledging, it just means that the bird has developed to the point where it can sustain flight. And that is our goal. Our goal is to, here in Connecticut, is to get these birds to get to the point where they can fend for themselves and migrate out of here. So once those little chicks hatch and dry off, they spend a lot of time foraging in that rack line that I talked about, which again is just that flotsam that kind of washes in with the tides. There tends to be a lot of invertebrates and whatnot that are in that rack line, and those little tiny chicks that are no bigger than a golf ball spend a lot of time eating. So if you think about it, the birds are, within about 28 days, those birds have to go from golf ball sized to, the size of their parents. It's a lot of development in just a few days. So beach rack is really important for these birds the first few days of their lives. So I'm going to jump in here and talk a little bit about least terns. So least terns are, they are also on the federal endangered species list because, like piping plovers, they have an Atlantic coast population, and then they have an interior Midwest population. Now it's only the Midwest. Oh, nope. Sorry, I take that back. Actually, this is wrong. The least terns, the Midwest population actually just got removed from the federal endangered species list. So excuse me, I have to update my slide. But either way, this bird is very similar to piping plovers in where they choose to nest and kind of how they nest. But it's been on our state endangered species list since 1992 as well as a threatened species. Now these birds show up a little bit later than piping plovers. They arrive in early May, and they are nesting in the same habitat, that same sandy habitat that piping plovers are nesting in. And oftentimes they set up shop amongst one another. So you'll sometimes in May, you've got, these piping plovers nesting, and then all of a sudden you go to do your monitoring and you've got a tern colony that's set up shop around them. And the terns actually, they think there is some benefit to having the terns nest amongst the piping plovers because terns are a pretty, they're a pretty ornery species, so they stick up for themselves, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But so these terns, they're laying 1 to 3 eggs in sandy habitat, just like piping plovers. The same type of nest as piping plovers, a small little scrape in the sand, and they lay similarly colored, sand-colored eggs. And even more interestingly, in this bottom left photo here with the arrow pointing down, that's a freshly hatched least tern chick, where the back of the bird is also speckled like sand as well. These eggs and young are cryptically colored to, again, try and avoid being eaten. So least terns are a little bit different from piping plovers in that the parents tend and feed their chicks. So those chicks are basically hanging out in the upper dunes a bit, and parents are bringing them small fish to eat. And as I mentioned before, least terns are kind of on the ornery side. They're very protective of their nests and their chicks. And you'll learn if you choose a site where least terns show up, if you get dive bombed or if you get thrown up on or pooped on, that means that you are very, very close to their nests or their chicks. So usually that's a good sign to back away if you're getting dive bombed by a least tern. So again, Whereas you have piping plover chicks that are like running all over the beach. Least-turned chicks tend to stay kind of in the dune areas, using the vegetation to hide from predators and get some shade while the parents bring food back to them. So, oh yeah, and again, aerial predators are pretty tough on least-turns. And actually, most everything likes a piping plover or a least-turned chick. So one thing that we struggle with a little bit, conservation challenge, if you will, are predators. So the natural and the not so natural predators. So me as a biologist, I'm not as concerned with predation of these birds by, you know, foxes, coyotes, gulls, peregrine falcons, etc. Those are all natural predators. The predators that are more disconcerting are the human subsidized predators, the predators that basically understand that human presence equates to food. So things like raccoons and skunks and house and feral cats and dogs. Those are the predators that we spend more time trying to, I guess, just, yeah, minimize the likelihood that they're going to be on our beaches. And again, it's, you know, raccoons and skunks love cruising the beach looking for, you know, gutted fish or, you know, bonfire remnants with food and whatnot. So all of our beach nesting sites, we always try and, you know, keep an eye to see if there's garbage issues. And if there are, then we'll contact the landowner or the municipality and ask them to kind of pick up the trash. A lot of our volunteers are super nice stewards, and they'll actually bring like a bag with them as they do their monitoring, and they'll pick up trash as they go along, which is, you know, not a requirement, but you know, I think it does help minimize minimizes the likelihood that you're going to have more of these human subsidized predators on the beach if there's less of an attractant. And then there's also the issue with like plastics and entanglements and fishing line, etc., that go along with humans and their garbage, and our garbage, I should say. So another conservation challenge that these birds have is the presence of dogs. So scientists have done studies, and you know, these birds are reacting to dogs as predators. You know, they're perceived as predators, whether they're leashed or not, whether, you know, you have your faithful canine companion that never strays from you. That dog is still perceived as a predator and stressing those birds out. So again, they're no different than foxes or coyotes to these birds. So one of the issues we have is, you know, dealing with dogs on the beach. Another conservation challenge is just human disturbance. As I said, there's many different competing user groups for beaches. People want to kayak, people want to play volleyball, people want to walk their dog, people want to kiteboard, fish, make sandcastles, etc. There's not a lot of beach, and there's just a ton of people that want to be there. So carving out, seeing beaches as habitat is something that we try and work on. So, which leads me into piping plover and least-turn management. Basically, how are we managing for all these different uses at these beaches, and how do we get these 40 to 50 pairs of birds to be productive? Well, so my agency since 1984 has been intensively monitoring beaches, Greenwich to Groton, every year. So there's approximately 13 to 16 sites that piping plovers tend to nest at. And these are the sites that you folks help us monitor. So our number one tool for managing shorebirds, funny enough, is just very simple string fencing. It's also called psychological fencing or stake and twine fencing. It's basically posts, wooden posts with string that cordon off kind of the sensitive nesting areas that these birds like to set up shop in. So usually most of our string fencing is up by, beginning to mid-April. And by cordoning off these areas, it minimizes the physical disturbance to breeding habitat. And when I say that, I mean, if you have a section of beach like this and you have people walking up and down, if you have people walking through this area day in, day out, all times a day, the birds are not going to settle down in that area. They're kind of looking for undisturbed stretches of beach to set up their nesting territories in. So this string fencing also, while it protects the birds, it also protects people from inadvertently stepping on eggs or chicks. You've got the 80-20 rule. 80% of people aren't, would be heartbroken if they stepped on a little chick. And then you have that 20% of people that aren't necessarily going to care. So I like to put it that this string fencing protects people from, inadvertently harming the birds. And this string fencing also creates a buffer between beachgoers and incubating birds. And what I mean by that is the birds, they're smart. When they're incubating, they're watching people, come and go. And if they know that they've got this kind of buffer between them and the beachgoers, they tend to settle down and they're not going to jump off the nest every time someone walks by. So it gives them kind of a bit of breathing room so that they're not all stressed out and reacting to us every time someone walks by. So managing these shorebirds is really dictated by the different behavior the birds elicit. Piping plovers act differently than least terns, even though they're nesting in the same areas. So piping plovers are they're a little bit more subtle than the least terns. Piping plovers will kind of escort you out of their nesting territory. If you look at this ribbon of beach, you'll have just nesting territory after nesting territory after nesting territory, just all along the beach. And these birds will kind of hop up and walk parallel to you as you're walking parallel to their nesting territory. And once you're beyond their nesting territory, they'll lose interest in you and head back to their territory. So they're not dive bombing you like these terns would. They're just escorting you out. And if you sometimes the birds nest in places that we don't anticipate. So there may not be string fencing up in all places. So one thing that you're going to want to look for is if you do see piping plovers and you see a piping plover that's using what we call a broken wing display. And you may have seen it with other birds like killdeer, which are cousins to piping plovers, utilize this display quite a bit. If you get too close to their chicks or their eggs, the parent will start flopping around in front of you, like acting like it has a broken wing. Its wing will be kind of stretched out and it will look really sad and pathetic. But that's what it's trying to do. If you were a predator and you had the choice between this bird's eggs or this injured bird, an injured bird is a better meal than 4 eggs. So the adults are purely trying to distract you and fake you into going after them as a meal versus their chicks or their eggs. So if you see a broken wing display, don't worry. The bird is just trying to protect its young. What it means, though, is that you are too close to its nest. So what you have to do is back up and towards the water if you see a bird acting like this. So piping plovers, because they are, they do a lot of walking. They're birds, yes, they can fly in, they can fly out, but they spend a lot of their day walking the beach, foraging, etc. So what we do in Connecticut here is when we find a piping plover nest, we will actually put some fencing around that nest to try and protect the eggs. Now, so that fencing keeps out most predators. The exception are rats and weasels, which can get through the fencing. But it keeps skunks and foxes and coyotes from eating those eggs. It is a stressful situation for the bird, so we don't take it lightly, and we don't exclose every nest, but we will do quite a few, especially on beaches where we're seeing a lot of sign of predators. So again, an exclosure is welded wire fencing that's placed around a nest. The bird can walk in and out, it's no problem. There's enough room between those wires for the birds to get in and out. Keeps predators and people out. It's fairly large. It's a bit of a spectacle on the beach. We bury the bottom so that it kind of discourages digging predators from trying to get under. And we do place bird netting on top to keep gulls and other aerial predators from getting to the adults that are incubating, as well as the eggs inside. And again, we selectively use them. We don't use them for every nest. So once those chicks hatch, they don't return to the exclosure. Like, I said, they dry off and they're out foraging. They don't return to the exclosure. They don't see that as any form of, it's not their home. They don't recognize it as being any, it's not protection to them, in their view. So at this stage of the game, when chicks are brand new and they're those little puff balls, they're highly susceptible to being stepped on or predated until they can fly. So again, least terns, their behavior is a little bit different. They tend to, they're not walkers like piping plovers. They don't escort you in and out of their territory. They're kind of like little fighter jets. They fly into the dune and they fly out. So fencing is an obstacle for these species. We don't fence least tern nests like we will piping plovers. String fencing is really the primary tool for management for least terns. That said, in the past, we have used, when we have the manpower and materials, we have fenced off large sections of the beach specifically for least terns. Again, it just keeps the skunks and foxes out of there primarily. But again, it's a lot of work and a lot of materials, and we don't always have that luxury. So the fourth tool that we use here for managing shorebirds in Connecticut is monitoring. And this is where you folks come in. So why is it so important? Why is it a tool in our toolbox of management? But you folks are going to be out collecting data for us. You're going to be letting us know where you're seeing the birds, how many birds you're seeing. Are you seeing chicks? Are you seeing predators? Are you seeing people harassing the birds? Are you seeing dogs off leash, etc.? You're going to be writing all that down for us, and you end up being the eyes and ears for us at all of these, these 13 to 16 sites we have to monitor. And you also serve an enforcement presence. Not that you are law enforcement, but there have been studies that show that if people are out looking at birds and caring about birds, it tends to maybe make people pause and think about, well, maybe they are important. So, and while you're out there, people will ask you questions. They're going to ask you, what are you looking at? And it's an opportunity for you to explain what you're looking at and the issues with those birds. And, many times at the beach, you have people that walk the beach every day, and then you have people that show up to the beach once a year, and you never know who you're going to run into. And if it's those people that show up to the beach once a year, then, it's a great learning opportunity for those folks. And also you are helping us with holiday weekends and special events, like offering some protection, getting us more information and data during those holiday weekends where, beach usage is really high. So Memorial Day weekend and July 4th weekend are big weekends where we really need extra eyes and ears out on these sites. And this monitoring is so important to us because it's really, in my opinion, it's the way that we meet our recovery goals most years. Without people out there looking and helping us educate the public and all that, we wouldn't be as successful as we have been. So monitoring, I've talked a lot about it. How is it done? Well, it requires walking the beaches to look for piping plovers. And Scott's going to go into that a little bit in a couple minutes. But you want to be sure that, is our string fencing up and or has it been pulled down, or have the tides washed it away? Letting us know if our signs and string fencing are up and adequate. You're going to be checking on the location and activity of piping plover pairs while you're there, and you're going to be staying outside of that string fencing. We want to walk the walk and talk the talk. So if we're telling other people to stay out of string fencing, we ourselves don't want to be in it either. So this little graphic here is kind of a nice, kind of tells a lot. You've got your dunes, you've got your dry sand, which is that sensitive nesting area. If you think back to that photo that had the big red oval on it, that's where the birds are going to be nesting. Wet sand, which basically means where the water is kind of lapping up, that is safe to walk. No birds are going to be nesting there. So walking along wet sand is always ideal. So again, you're going to want to be aware of species-specific behavior. Is this piping plover, as you're doing your monitoring, is this piping plover escorting you down the beach? If so, maybe it has a nesting territory nearby. Is it using a broken wing display? Oof. If so, then you're probably quite close to its eggs or young. Is the least turn dive bombing you? Then you are too close to those least turn nesting area. And the more you practice, the more you get out there and walk the beaches and watch what the birds are doing and how they interact with people and other birds, the better you're going to get. It's going out in the field and monitoring piping plovers is always enjoyable to me, even after the many, many years that I've done it. It's just a great day. Great way to spend a day. So we always, we're in generally going for a share the beach philosophy. I don't want Connecticut to have bumper stickers that say piping plovers taste like chicken, like you see in Massachusetts and Long Island. I want people to be happy that the birds are there, and I don't want people to see the birds as a nuisance, so when you're out there monitoring, remind people it's okay to remind people to respect the signs and fenced off areas, and remind people to keep their dogs away from the nesting birds. And a great message for if you interact with the public is that, all these birds need is a little bit of time and space to raise their young. I think that resonates with most parents. And if just pointing out that cordoning off a small area of beach so that these birds can nest, it seems like kind of a small thing to do. But, always try and talk to folks, talk about the birds positively. Again, we're trying to have it be a share the beach philosophy here in Connecticut. So on that note, I'm going to talk to you about being a good witness. So these birds are regulated species here in Connecticut. So that means there are laws that protect them. And where there's laws, there is enforcement of laws. I was not able to get an environmental conservation police officer, which is DEP's enforcement branch. I unfortunately could not get them to attend today and talk to you about being a good witness, but I'll just go over some of what they would have gone over. So, so these are the folks that we're calling if there is a situation of take with a bird. So remember, I talked about take as being hunting, pursuing, harassment, etc., of a federally threatened species. So if you see that during your monitoring, you're going to be calling our NCON police. So, and what NCON asks of us is to be a good witness. You know, I'm not a law enforcement officer. None of you are law enforcement officers. All we can do is be a good witness for them to do their job. So, in being a good witness, you want to, first of all, consider your safety at all times. It's your highest priority. If you are in danger or feel in danger, you're going to call 911 to get state police or your local police officers to respond. If you are safe, but the issue is, you know, the birds being in danger through, you know, someone trying to harm the birds or dogs chasing the birds, you're going to call our NCON police officers immediately. So if a conflict or hostile situation arises, you know, you're going to diffuse the situation by identifying yourself as a Connecticut DEP volunteer piping plover monitor, explain that you're just observing the birds, and that if they have any questions to call DEP at this number. And this number will be plastered over all of the materials you're going to receive. So you don't have to rush to write it down. That's basically my phone number. So you may relay beach regulation information if you're comfortable, such as open or closed areas. And I'm talking about the string fenced areas. Those are quote unquote closed areas, and open areas are everywhere else. And you can say that dogs are not permitted during the nesting season if that is indeed true. Part of the information that we're going to send to you as well is information on the dog regulations at the different beaches. So you always want to familiarize yourself with those regulations if you're going to be monitoring at a particular beach, because you don't want to be reminding someone that dogs are not permitted if indeed the dogs are permitted, because that tends to get people's hackles up. You would never attempt to physically confront anyone or verbally give any commands or demand any personal information from any beachgoers. None of that is within our purview. We are only there to just relay information. So the guidelines for being a good witness are to be observant. You're going to learn to describe what you've seen and take notes should you see someone purposely harming a piping plover or least term. If there's a vehicle involved, you're going to make sure you write down a description of the vehicle, a description of the people involved, the date and time of day, record exact time of occurrence, record all times that later may be important. Familiarize yourself with locations and distances, being able to describe the area and give like a pretty good measurement. There's a difference between 50 feet and 50 yards, you know, kind of have an idea of how far things are. You've got the weather conditions. They can be really important to visibility. Describe details of what happened, describe verbal exchanges. And if there is a crime scene, please do not disturb that crime scene. You want the police officers to come and have everything be intact so that they can do their own investigation. Do not remove any carcasses or eggs. DEEP is really the only authority to have federally listed species in our possession. and all of this, all of these tips and whatnot are included in an incident observation form that you'll have in your information packet. So if I were you, I would make sure I have that packet with me every time I go out and monitor, because if you run into a situation like this and you need to collect this information, this form helps jog your memory. If you fill this form out and NCON is there and you can hand that to them, that's super helpful for them. And again, you know, most of the time these situations may be a surprise or a shock, and we're not always thinking like a law enforcement officer when we're in shock or yeah. So enough about that. I just want to mention real quick that there are some piping plovers that are involved in some biological studies, and those birds have been marked with bands. So you'll see in these photos, you know, these piping plovers have different colored bands along their legs. Now, if you see birds with bands on them, please let me know. It's important. Those bands are on there in order for people to observe them and report that information. So identifying like big migratory stopover areas, identifying how far these birds go, where they overwinter, etc. All those questions have been answered through banding studies. So if you see a bird with bands, if you can take a photo, awesome. If you can't, then just, if you can describe it to us as best you can, wonderful. But get me that information when you can, or actually relatively soon. So that's about, I think, all I had to say. Hold on, let me, yep. So I don't know if we want to wait till the very, very end to do questions, and maybe we should, because we have so much material to cover. So yes, put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end.
Okay, thank you for the awesome overview of piping plovers, least terns, and their management, Laura. Another species that you are likely to see out on the beach are American oystercatchers, and this is another species that we're asking you to monitor and engage beachgoers about. American oystercatchers are also state threatened, and their sort of North American population size is about 5,000 pairs. And in Connecticut, we typically have between 75 and 100 breeding and non-breeding pairs. And you can see their distribution on the map on this slide. You can go to the next slide, Laura. And piping plovers are similar American oystercatchers are similar to piping plovers and least terns in some ways. They arrive about the same time as the piping plovers. Typically, well, the first ones arrived in Connecticut this week, so they're, as did the piping plovers, so they're arriving at about the same time. They are sort of territorial nesters, so you might have one pair, and then further down the beach you might have another pair. Further down the beach you might have another pair. And they also lay their eggs directly on the sand. They are a little bit more flexible than piping plovers, because they'll also lay their eggs in areas where there's lots of shells. And sometimes, especially out on islands, they'll lay their eggs just directly on rocks. So a little bit more flexibility in where they'll nest, but in that same area generally, between the rack line and where the sort of dune grasses start. That's roughly, whether it's a sandy substrate, a shelly substrate, or a rocky substrate, that's the general area where they are nesting. And these guys will typically lay 2 to 3 eggs, and incubation lasts between 24 and 29 days. And like the piping plover, both parents will incubate. When these chicks hatch, they are semi-precocial, which means that it's kind of like the least tern chicks. They are mobile, they have feathers, but then they do follow their parents around, and their parents provide them food. The piping plovers are the most able-bodied from the moment they hatch. They can walk, they can feed themselves. Easy parenting there. The oyster catchers can walk, they can move around, but they really rely on their parents to feed them, versus the least terns, can move around a little bit, but they mostly stay in one spot and wait for their parents to bring them food. And it takes roughly 35 days for an American oyster chick to get from hatching to fledging. Next slide. So this is just a picture that sort of shows, similar to the piping plovers and the least terns, American oystercatcher eggs and nests and chicks are pretty camouflaged. If you look at this picture, there's actually 3 American oystercatcher chicks in the picture. And they do really blend in. The parents are quite a bit more visible. They have a very distinct coloration, but the chicks, are very, very camouflaged, just like the plover chicks and the least tern chicks. Next slide. This slide here is just to sort of show you what they look like when they sort of reach the stage of fledging. In this picture, there's one adult American oystercatcher, which is the bird in the center. And you can see that its entire beak is bright orange. And then the 2 birds on the left, and on the bird on the left and the bird on the right, you can actually see that the tip of their beak is still black. And that's sort of how you can distinguish a fledgling bird from an adult bird, or a juvenile bird from an adult bird. And the interesting thing about American oystercatchers, the reason they're so dependent on their parents to feed, for food, for the whole time period that they're kind of going from being a chick to a fledgling, and actually even after that, is that it takes quite a while for their beak to grow. The birds in this picture, they don't have full-size beaks yet, and they can stay with their parents for up to a year. Just learning how to feed. There are 2 different foraging techniques that you'll see oyster catchers use. Some of them will hammer a shell until it breaks open. And then some of them will sort of sneak up and then sort of jab at a shell, and they'll actually cut the abductor muscle in the shell, and then it'll just sort of pop open. So these are techniques that they have to actually learn from their parents. So it does take them quite a while to be able to forage on their own. Next slide. This is a map that just sort of shows where oyster catchers are distributed across the state. They are, while the piping plovers and least terns are concentrated at, 13 to 16 sites, the oyster catchers are at quite a large number of sites. They definitely overlap with the plovers and least terns. Where we have sort of both plovers and oyster catchers are places like Campo Beach, Pleasure Beach, Long Beach, Milford Point, Sandy Point, Griswold Point, and Bluff Point. But then the oyster catchers nest in a lot of other locations too. And a lot of those nests are actually on offshore islands. Some of the places where they're concentrated are at Kokini Island and the Norwalk Islands, in Westport and Norwalk, at the Westbrook Barrier Islands, and also at Sandy Point Island down in Stonington. Next slide. So this is just a little bit on the sort of productivity of American oyster catchers over the last 10 years. This past year, 2020, actually ended up being a pretty good year for American oyster catchers. Birds that were able to sort of nest very early in the season roughly did well. And our birds that nested on beaches actually did quite well this last year. Overall productivity was 0.85, which is the second highest since 2012. Next slide. So as I mentioned, they are pretty widespread along the Connecticut coast. There are 144 sites that we survey every year to sort of check and see if there are American oyster catchers present. And in 2020, 56 of those sites were used, and we had breeding birds at 31 of those sites. And of those 31 sites, 77% were offshore islands, and 23% were mainland beaches. And, typically the birds do better on those offshore islands because there's, less predators, people, need to have a boat to get out to them. So there typically is less disturbance. But in 2020, because some of the beaches had restrictions on visitation, it actually kept the number of people at some beaches down. So we actually had a pretty high success on our mainland beaches as well. So 0.92% or 0.92 fledglings per pair on mainland beaches and 0.83 fledglings per pair on islands. So altogether, that's why we had a pretty good success rate last year. Next slide. Another thing that we're asking you to kind of keep an eye out for, similar to piping plovers, oyster catchers, a good number of them are banded. Audubon, Connecticut has an oyster catcher banding program. And between 2018 and 2020, we banded a total of 30 birds. And those birds have a metal U.S. Geological Survey band on the lower portion of one of their legs. And then they have yellow field readable bands on the upper portion of those legs. And the field readable bands will either, the yellow ones will either start with a T or they'll start with the letter N. So the letter T or the letter N, and then they'll have, a few numbers after it. So if you see those birds, you should be able to, with just a pair of binoculars or with a camera with a zoom lens, you should actually be able to take note of what the number is, and you can report that to CT Waterbirds, which is our email address, or directly to Beth Amendola, who sort of leads our oyster catcher work. And I'm sure she'll throw her email address in the chat. And then you can also report those bands to the American Oystercatcher Working Group, and I'll show you that address on the next slide. But this is just a little bit of information on where our oyster catchers that we've banded in Connecticut have gone during the winter months, and kind of gives you a sense of what we're learning by banding American oyster catchers. So we've had birds that nest in Connecticut go as far south as the Gulf of Fonseca and El Salvador, which is pretty exciting. And when we have birds that go that far south, one thing we notice is they actually tend to leave the breeding grounds about middle of the summer, versus birds that aren't going as far south tend to leave the breeding grounds or staging areas in Connecticut later in the summer, sort of like September and October. But we've had birds go, to Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, New York, quite a few different places. And what's neat is we also can get a sense of survival from year to year. If the birds are, return to the same, they do typically return roughly to the same nesting areas. We have discovered that they do move around a little bit, but most of the time they return to the same areas. And they also return to the same staging areas during migration. So Milford Point is kind of a known staging area. There's a spot in Rhode Island that's a known staging area. The Kokini Island is a known staging area. So birds that are nesting in other areas, not too far away from those staging areas, will go to those places before they migrate south. They'll hang out there for a while, then they'll go south. And then when they come north again, they'll hang out at those staging areas for a bit before they go to their breeding sites. And an example of that is Oystercatcher N24. This isn't a bird that breeds in Connecticut, but in the fall of 2019, we were able to band this bird at Milford Point while it was staging. And then this past winter, it was found in Virginia. And this week it showed up back at Milford Point again. So, kind of showing up at a staging area, probably stay there for a week or so, and then it'll head off to its breeding location, likely in Massachusetts. Next slide. So like I mentioned, you can, share oyster catcher bands with the CT Waterbirds email or with Beth Amendola, or alternatively, you can directly log them in to the American Oystercatcher website, which is amoywg.org. And from there, you can actually sort of enter the information about what banded bird you saw, and you actually get information directly about that bird, where it, where it was originally banded, where else it's been resighted. So you can kind of keep a log of your banded oyster catcher sightings, which is kind of fun. So it's just something we wanted to let you know was out there. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott to talk to you about data collection and scheduling.
Okay, thank you, Corey, and thank you, Laura. A lot of the information I'm about to discuss touches on what both of my colleagues had. We know it's a lot to take in at the moment, but again, this is all recorded, will be put on YouTube. We're here to answer questions now and later, and we have a couple weeks before the season starts. So don't feel overwhelmed or confused. We'll get through it all, no problem. Essentially, we are asking you to sign up to volunteer monitor from April to August. We really don't have time restrictions on it anymore. If you can go once a month for a few hours, great. If you want to go once or twice a week to a certain location, terrific. And every spot somewhat has a different amount of time that it takes to cover fully. We're going to be recording and collecting data for our piping plovers, least terns, common terns, and American oyster catchers. We're going to be reporting problems that we see, such as nest abandonment or predator issues, people who are entering fencing areas or kiteboarding, might have dogs, that sort of thing. More day-to-day, less malicious, more innocuous stuff you're going to be reporting to us at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. We're going to be educating beachgoers who might have questions about the birds or what's happening or what's going on, or might have a dog, or might be getting too close to the string fencing areas when possible. Obviously, this year is a little different because of COVID-19. We're not asking you to go out and do that necessarily if you don't feel comfortable. And certainly while we're doing that, we'll be abiding by standard protocols like social distancing, wearing a mask, and so forth. And this year, normally we would have you assist us in putting up the string fenced areas and signage. Exclosures are put up solely by DEEP and staff, but string fencing and signage is typically done with the public's assistance. However, this year, at least in the spring, to put up the fencing, we will not be doing that. It remains to be determined whether we'll have people who might be asked to help us out for fireworks displays or taking down the fencing later this year. Remember that when you're going out to monitor piping plovers, yes, you're going to the beach and it's a beautiful place where, you know, you might be recreating normally, but for our purposes, we want to make sure that it's, you know, a job with responsibilities and to keep the appropriate amount of behavior and dress and appearance in mind. We're going to be talking to people when monitoring wildlife, and the perception that people have of all of this is coming through those of us who are going out to monitor. So you want to make sure that you filled out all your paperwork with DEEP and have your volunteer badge and lanyard. You want to make sure, again, that you're wearing something that's appropriate for the beach in terms of monitoring and not recreating or going swimming or so forth, and not undertaking activities such as drinking or smoking or going out for a swim or fishing while we're monitoring. You always want to make sure you have a few essential things, such as your volunteer ID badge. You want to have binoculars or spotting scope so you can view the birds from afar and not disturb them. You may want to have brochures to hand out later on in the season when we get into more, hopefully, you know, public interaction. You definitely want to have something to take down notes about the birds and about your day, such as your start time, your end time, what the tide was like, the weather. You want to have your phone, of course, always. You may also want to have something like sunblock, keeping in mind the beach is very cold, especially early in the spring. It can be cold and windy, so you want to bundle up enough. You want to have water, snacks, insect repellent, sunblock, and so forth. And for safety reasons, we want to make sure not only the birds are safe, but you're safe. So if it's very cold, very hot, 95, very high humidity, extremely windy days where there may be thunderstorms, that's when you want to stay home for the birds and yourself. Even if you feel comfortable and you're willing to risk it, please don't, for all of our sake, but also for the birds. You want to always make sure that you record the weather, the time, the date, the tides, your name if you were monitoring with someone else, keeping careful notes of the birds, scanning down the beach ahead so you don't have to walk immediately and flush birds or disturb them or potentially get in the way of young birds who may be further down along the beach. We want to, of course, make sure that we don't enter the symbolic fencing at any time because we are there to monitor from afar, and we don't want to add to the disturbances of the birds, nor do we want to set an example that would be bad for other beachgoers. And we want to make sure that we record the behavior of the piping plovers and the least terns, American oyster catchers, and so forth in as much detail as possible. what were they doing? Were they feeding? Were they resting, incubating? How many were there? And then if they were paired, if they were courting, if you had a family of 4 young chicks with an adult by the water who were looking to feed, that information is great. And make sure that you're, again, following the bird's cues if they're trying to lead you away from an area, if they feel threatened because you're too close, and so forth. So with that in mind, we want to monitor but minimize the amount of time that we're in nesting areas. And in general, we want to make sure that we don't add to the problems by putting, man-made objects near the nest to mark them. Please just take a picture, even if it's with your mind, and say, oh, well, about 50 feet from the last jetty and 20 feet from the water line, I saw what might potentially be a nest. And you can report that. And we don't want to be doing things like counting eggs, because we know once a nest is complete, there will be 4 eggs in it and they'll be all set. So we don't need to go close to it. We don't need to see that. And we want to prioritize the safety and well-being of the birds over anything else when it comes to data. Even if you don't get the full picture, even if you don't get all the information, even if you feel something might be wrong with it, that's fine, because we'd rather have that error rather than an error that leads to the death or demise of our birds. If you see something like a nest abandoned or destroyed, that might be not from a malicious action, just from tidal action or storm or possibly a predator, just make sure you email us as soon as you can. And a lot of this, again, you're emailing ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, whether it's with the banded birds, whether it's with this sort of thing. Please email everything you can to ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, but also include deep in the examples that Laura mentioned, or potentially Beth and the American Oystercatcher working group and the examples that Corey mentioned. And that way we all kind of have the information. And the sooner we know, the better. The same goes for if we're seeing predators like fish crows sitting on an exclosure. We have fox tracks all over the beach. That's great information that we need to know. Once we get into chicks hatching, we're going to want to record the adults and the chicks, but again, making sure that we maintain a respectful distance, because their safety is more important than the data. We're all going out there, and that's why we have so many monitors and staff, so that we can all collect the information at different times, tides, situations. And when we put it all together on our end, we'll be able to form the perfect picture of what's actually happening. So if you have to omit part or you can't get all the information you need, that's fine. Again, if you see suspicious behavior or a person may be responsible for harming the birds in some way, you're going to follow the good witness guidelines and call the deep ENCON police, as Laura outlined, and you're going to be filling out reports and information for her in the same capacity. You can go on. So again, monitoring is needed April to August, and we want to keep in mind that the beaches typically in a given year have the most traffic on weekends, holidays, and during warm beach weather. That will largely remain the same this year. However, I would say there may be more people than usual at other times as well, because they're finding something safe and better to do than spending time indoors after the past year of COVID. And we certainly want to have people focused again more on those high traffic beaches and beaches with more of the birds, which I'll go over in a minute, which locations. And you've already mostly all signed up and emailed me at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. When we go over locations in a moment, and for the next couple of weeks before we officially start, we will finalize schedules, which includes essentially what dates or day of the week that you want to visit, and AM or PM. It doesn't have to be perfectly specific, because it might change for tides or your time personally or otherwise, but just a general sense of when. And if you need to alter the schedule or miss a monitoring session, it's totally fine, but just please let us know at ctwaterbirds@gmail.com so that we know who is where, when, or not there when. Locations include Sherwood Island State Park in Westport. We may also have birds at Campo Beach, Pleasure Beach in Bridgeport, Long Beach, Russian Beach, and Short Beach in Stratford, Milford Point and Silver Sand State Park in Milford, Sandy and Morse Points in West Haven, Griswold Point in Old Lyme, and Bluff Point State Park in Groton. We may have some limited availability for Hammonasset. We might be able to add a couple other locations as well, depending on if birds are nesting there or not. And we're going to be letting you know, as the birds come in, we'll see if we have a spot or two that we need to add more people to. And the areas that typically have the most birds and people are Long Beach and Stratford, Milford Point and Milford, Sandy and Morse Points and West Haven, and Bluff Point and Grant. So those are the priorities. Data submission. So we've gone over what we're doing in the field when, and how we need to search for birds and what we'll be finding. And when you come back from your monitoring session, as soon as you can, when it's hopefully the same day or the next day, if you have a lot going on, it's all right. But as soon as possible, if you could please submit your data. We take all of it via electronic form. And in our blog at ctwaterbirds.blogspot.com, you'll see the right-hand column labeled important documents. And you'll also see online data submission form. And there is where you will want to put all of your information. It's really useful to go and click on this and check it out in the next week or two so that you can see what is there and what's required. And we find that this method is best because it will have everything that you essentially need to answer. It will prompt you for the date, the time, the location, the tide, the birds, if they were hatchlings or fledglings or adults, if they were paired, nests, weather information, all of that. So you won't be forgetting something in reporting your data because you'll be prompted to provide it all. So if you take a look at that in the next week or two and scan it over, you'll see what we need. It's basically what we've covered in the presentation so far, but it will help quite a bit. If you have any questions with that, you can just email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com, but it's a pretty straightforward Google Doc and we haven't had any issues with it. If you would like to submit maybe other data when you are in the field on your own time, if you go somewhere that has other birds and isn't a monitoring location, you can always submit the data for those other spots and some of your recreational activities more through eBird if you share the checklist with ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. If you have bird photos or other questions, things about sightings for other birds, we're always here to help. So just email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. And again, please do submit your data as soon as you can. The more we have coming in on a faster, more almost live basis, the better we can deploy our staff. We can take care of any disturbances or issues that come up, and we can stay on top of everything in the state. And just always, please do keep in mind to record your hours and time along with your trip and submit that as well. We will definitely, we'll touch on a few different points as we get a little further into questions, but I want to make sure we emphasize that as we go out, we want to make sure that we are keeping this data and information somewhat to ourselves within this group here. If you're sharing it, certainly with CT Waterbirds, if you're speaking with Laura or Corey or Beth or whomever else of our field staff, terrific. But we have to bear in mind that we have all this information and data. And in the past few years, especially photographers, and while I'm a professional photographer and we have other photographers in the group and other professionals work in this field, so we respect it, but we have had a very problematic time with people who are pushing their luck and causing a great detriment to the birds with their behavior, whether it's just putting a lawn chair and we're going to sit next to the nests all day and photograph them, or, oh, we heard about this somewhat uncommon species that's nesting here, so we're all going to get in the car and drive over from New York or Massachusetts or downstate and just be wanting to view it for hours on end. We want to provide the public information and education, but we want to make sure that at all times we're remembering these are very, very sensitive birds and they're very much an attractant. You might see me sharing photos of birds now. I won't be so much in April and May because I don't want to be encouraging people to go out and photograph them and to be essentially harassing them at a close range. And while you can take photos of the birds, it's please, please, please bear in mind it has to be very far away. You can crop them later and, we can use those zooms as much as we can, but we don't ever want to be harming the birds and making the situation worse while we're monitoring. So we really need to keep an eye on what we're putting out publicly. And at the end of the year, later in the summer, we can all talk about the great success we had and share information and some pictures and all the rest. But when we're in the heat of the season, we have to be mindful of that. And we're going to be keeping an eye on other disturbances like drones, which have increased in recent years. And there's a whole host of different things that come up. And it's changed a lot, even in the decade that we've done this. And I see there was a question about the best time to go out. There really is no best time because we want people to go out at all times. You might find birds very active at near sunrise or sunset, or maybe very active in the middle of the day. They might be changing their behavior based on the weather conditions and the tides, because tides are always changing. So we really got to hit every part of every day, and some randomness is actually excellent because it adds to the better quality data. And you can go on if you like, Laura.
Hey, okay, I just have to get into my COVID precautions too, and I'm wondering if it makes sense to do it now or if it makes sense to do it after we talk about sites. Do you have a preference?
You can do it now.
Okay, it's quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so since DEP Wildlife Division is kind of the responsible for our volunteers, I do need to talk quickly about COVID-19 guidance for our volunteers, since you are all Wildlife Division volunteers. Please follow these guidelines, even if you have had COVID or have received a vaccine. And none of this is this is all standard stuff, but I just need to say it. Please wear an appropriate face covering when you are near other people, including outdoors. Just make sure that you have it in your pocket. If you get close to people, you'll have that face covering to throw on quickly. Maintain 6 feet of social distance around others. Individuals actively exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19 are in quarantine or are in regular close contact with an individual who is experiencing symptoms should not participate in volunteer work until they are well. Individuals at high risk for COVID-19 or in regular close contact with high-risk people should not participate in volunteer work. And if you are sharing any equipment with people that you're birding with, please take care to disinfect any shared equipment. So none of this is controversial. We just want to not only protect you and us and still not spread this anymore. So, all right, I'm gonna head back to locations so Scott can talk to you about locations. All right.
I would say as well, thank you, Laura, that we want to make sure. I've had people ask about, oh, well, what if I see other volunteers, or what if we overlap, or are people going on the same day as I am? And don't worry about that. That's great, because kind of like Laura said, just your mere presence there is seen as almost a deterrent to poor behavior from others. So if you see, wow, there's this person, these people, and that person and that one, they're all monitoring the birds. Well, that's pretty good coverage. And you may go out on the same day as somebody else and see entirely different birds, because maybe they were back in the marsh feeding when you went through those piping plovers. Maybe those oyster catchers came in just for you and landed on the shoreline and were taking one of their young over, teaching it to feed or so forth. So things change by the hour with the weather, the tides, what the birds are doing. It's really important. So don't feel at all that you're not helping. If you're all together, if you see different people on the same day, if you're have different data on the same day, things change. It changes by the minute. And yeah, here are some of the locations we talked about. Sherwood Island State Park is one. It typically doesn't have birds, but we always check it, and it may certainly, given that Campo Beach did. And you see Bikini Island is not monitored by volunteers, but there it is. Bridgeport, Stratford, and Milford have a bunch of places, including Pleasure Beach, which is accessible in Bridgeport from the long hike down Long Beach in Stratford. Long Beach is a very busy place. Short Beach in Stratford is less busy, but typically now has a pair that at least attempts to nest. And it's pretty close to the parking area. It's not a long walk. Milford Point is very busy with all of our species typically. It's one of the best spots in Connecticut and has quite a number of people. Silver Sand State Park is a little quieter in terms of birds because there are so many people there and because it's limited habitat, but you can get a pair at times and we'll see what happens this year. And same for East Broadway. Some of these spots are just monitored essentially by, a couple of volunteers who do this every year as well. We tend to focus our volunteer efforts on the bigger sites like Sandy Point, whereas you see Peck Avenue can occasionally have a pair, and that would be monitored more by a volunteer or two or staff. Hammonasset will be on the list probably for some of the publicly accessible areas. So if you live very close, let me know, and you might be able to do it there. Griswold Point and Old Lyme, we will be taking, if you're monitoring in Sandy and Morse Points in West Haven or Griswold Point and Old Lyme, if you plan to, please do send me your vehicle make and model and license plate as well. We will have passes made for you. And while I'm saying that, that prompts me to think of talking about accessing some of these places. Once you have your monitoring badge and ID, you will be able to use that to access, say, Stratford's Long Beach, even if you are not a resident, don't have a sticker, you'll just have to show it. And of course, don't have all of your, beach gear in the back with the umbrella out and the cooler here, like you're going to party at the beach. Please just go for monitoring purposes, and then they will let you in without charge and without an issue. If there ever is an issue, please let us know and we'll correct that. And there you have Harkness, which is monitored by staff, Waterford Town Beach, which is monitored by some of our volunteers and can occasionally have a pair of birds. And Bluff Point State Park is another very busy place for birds and people and always requires your help. And I think, as I try to think about things that I need to touch on, I think I've touched on nearly everything that I need to, and I think my colleagues have as well, but we can definitely open it up for any questions that we may have had backed up in the chat if we haven't touched on those, and then we'll take more.
I have one quick thing. Sorry, I was a total knucklehead when we were doing introductions and forgot to introduce my field tech extraordinaire, Rebecca Foster, who, if you're out on the beach, Rebecca will be there. If you're monitoring any of these sites, you will likely run into Rebecca, and she's the heart and soul of this program, and I couldn't do it without her. And so if you do see her, please stop and say hello.
Yeah, so I think at this point we've covered everything we're going to cover. And if you guys have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can let you unmute, and then you can sort of just ask your question as well.
And as we said, if you have questions and comments on other things in days to come, totally fine. We do this by design, so we have a couple weeks to prepare to get everything ready before you go out to the beach, and we'll figure out those schedules, take all your information. We'll start to get the process of mailing done through Deep, but we'll get it all taken care of. And I see a question there. First, can you review the photography guidelines again, please? Photography, again, you can take photos, and it's useful at times because you may be able to have a photo of a banded oystercatcher, and you see that and you send it back to us, and we can see the band number and get a view of the bird. Great. If you see a group of, kids going in the fencing, that's a good thing to take a picture of, again, from afar safely with all the previously mentioned thoughts in mind. But when it comes to our birds, you can take the pictures, but just please do everything safely. If you're taking photos in a way that the birds don't even see you or don't react to you, then you're doing a great job, and that's awesome. We just don't want to be encroaching too close to the nest. We don't want to be chasing after young. We don't want to be setting an example for others to follow that might be a poor one on the beach. And typically the month of March is a great time to go see and photograph the birds without disturbing them, because they're just coming back. They don't have nests, they don't have young. So if you can get out just on your own time in the next couple of weeks and get a sense of your beach and the birds and what it might look like and that sort of thing, that would be awesome.
Go ahead.
Oh, no,
I just wanted to address the question about NCON being responsive. So in the packet of information that it will be up at CT Waterbirds on the website, that will have information about the dog, basically the animal control officers for each municipal beach. So it depends. So is NCON responsive? Yes, if they have an officer in the area. They're spread pretty thin. But calling NCON is usually a situation where there's a dead bird or a stepped on nest and you saw it happen, or you see people letting their dogs through the string fencing, or if you're at a state park and there's an issue there. Those are the situations where NCON has authority. If you are at Long Beach, which is a municipal beach, you're not going to call NCON if you see dogs chasing, if you see dogs off leash or whatnot. You're going to call the municipal animal control officer for that situation. So there's a lot of like parsing out who to call based on what the situation is, but we do have that information in our packet, which we will be either, I'm not sure, are we going to send it, Scott, or are we just going to put it up on the internet, on the website and have people get it themselves?
I was going to ask you that earlier. It's probably easier to just provide that electronically, I'm surmising.
Okay.
On your part, certainly, because you will, and to answer another question, you will mail a deep liability waiver to everyone to be signed. And we can then have that sent back to you via snail mail or electronically.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So we will put the essentially long list of dog laws and regulations in the blog, and we'll email that to all of you. And you will be mailed the deep liability waiver, which you can sign and send back. And tying that into the next question, the next step for all of you, if you have not provided your information to me, please do. You will email ctwaterbirds@gmail.com with your name, your email, your desired beach and schedule, your mailing address, so that we can send that liability waiver to you and your ID badge for the season and a lanyard. And if you are monitoring in Old Lyme or West Haven, you will also need to provide me your vehicle make, model, and license plate so that we can get parking passes for you. And I believe that's all we need for the moment out of everyone. But again, it's a great time to go to the beach and get a sense of what the birds are like and what your beach looks like right now safely. If you can do that, that would be awesome. And we'll answer all kinds of other questions along the way. I remember a question from earlier, which Beth and Rebecca have answered. Piping plovers and oystercatchers, they will renest if they lose their nest or their young. If they have successfully hatched young and you know they're parenting and bringing them around, even if they lose them, they probably won't, and they'll be just heading south. But they will renest if they lose them. It's typically up to 3 times to try to renest. So they'll nest once. If they lose it, they'll nest again. If they lose it, they may nest again if it's early enough in the season. And Corey answered the question of photographing and stopping others. We don't really, again, we don't want to ever try to prevent someone from doing something, let's say, because we're not in the municipal or state law enforcement, but we just try to educate and help and suggest things in always a nice, happy, cheery, pleasant way, especially this year, because it's been a long year. People are on edge. People are usually on edge and want to be somewhat antagonistic if they're being stopped, or they love their dog, and we all love dogs too. We all have dogs here. We love dogs. But if you're trying to stop someone with a dog, it's basically you telling them and their child what to do or what not to do. That can get a little difficult, and all the more so after the past year. So we want to make sure that we're just more reporting that or suggesting it in a happy, positive, upbeat way, or we're sending it to the proper authorities, whomever that may be in whatever capacity, whether it's a town, animal control or police, or it's something that rises to the level of NCON if the dogs are chasing after chicks and so forth. We will have the list of locations via email and in the blog. Again, a lot of this information, again, will be, if you're on our email list and you've already sent in your information, I will be emailing you essentially, probably I'm on average about once a week with data and information, whether it's field observations or this sort of thing. And we will also always be putting things in ctwaterbirds.blogspot.com in the blog space. So those are two good spots to keep an eye on.
And getting back to the photography question, you're going to get plenty of opportunities to get amazing photos. Again, we do ask that you wait till outside of the breeding season to post them a lot of times. You know, over the course of the season, you get a feel of how each individual bird acts. And I think one rule of thumb is that when you hear the birds, you know, if you're out there and there are piping plovers in the region, stop, be observant. You know, sometimes they're right near you when they peep low, and you know, you really don't want to be walking any closer anyways. So sometimes if you just snow ops, but you're also going to be safer by not continuing. You really want to use your ears when you're out there monitoring. The oyster catchers and the plovers and the terns all have distinctive alarm calls. You know, just you know, feel free to bring your camera along. You're going to get photo opportunities in the course of your monitoring. Just try to do it where you're having a minimal impact.
Yeah, and if you're standing in that wet sand area, kind of right along the water line and going in the places that Laura described well to be safe, and you're just there, then you're in a good spot to begin with, and you'll probably be fine.
Right, and that did remind me, high tide is one of the more stressful times for migratory shorebirds and for the nesting shorebirds, just because the area is all really, you know, they're all pushed up onto the whatever uplands are remaining. It's a really stressful time. There's no room between you and the fencing. That's the time when I would be especially careful about, you know, really not dilly-dallying with photography, and maybe even avoiding high tides at some sites altogether while you're doing for your monitoring activities. At low tide, there's generally plenty of room for everybody to share the shore, especially, you know, towards western Long Island Sound with their huge tidal ranges.
Yeah, and there's definitely, you know, again, we want to make sure we keep photos to ourselves, but just the information as well. There's a lot of places now, whether it's email bird lists, Facebook groups, etc., where people often post detailed information about birds or where they're nesting or where one rare one has been spotted. But bear in mind, when you do so, you're opening that up not only to everyone who's in that group or on that email list, which may be hundreds or thousands of people. There are thousands more who will hear about it from others or can read it publicly anyway. So we really want to make sure our information is kept confidential between basically all of us in this group. And then later in the year, when things are all finished and concluded, then great, we can talk about the experiences more and brag about this great sighting we have or all the things that we got to see. That's awesome. But we want to hold that as long as possible.
So one thing I wanted to add is for folks that are really brand new to the shore and need a little bit, aren't quite sure what we want from you. I am thinking about holding an additional training small for like people that really like need that extra help in April, to go down to a site, and we'll walk the site, and I will show you behavior of the birds and what to do, what not to do, that sort of thing, for those that are feeling anxiety about doing things properly. So I have to clear that with my my supervisor and all that, because there are limits as to how many people I can have as a training, an on-site training. So I need to figure that out, but that would be in April sometime. So just keep that in mind, and I'll send that information through Scott out to you. So I guess just more information coming. Oh, and one last thing too. Quick thing, for those of you that don't know, because I learned this my first year doing shorebird work, is that in Connecticut, if you are in front of, if you're near houses, if you're not at a municipal beach or a state beach, if you're in front of someone's house on the beach, you should know that their private land ends at the mid-high water mark. So if you're looking at that rack line, you'll see the low tide rack line, mid tide, and then a high tide. You should know that if you're above that high tide mark, you're on private property, and people do get somewhat territorial about that, and you might get yelled at. So always be sure, if you're walking in wet sand, you're fine. You're in the public area. You're on public property, in the public domain, I guess I should say. So if all else fails, plant your feet in wet sand, and you're fine. And I can talk about that later if someone has questions.
Scott, one of the questions in the chat is there a list of monitoring locations online? I just looked and I don't think there is, but will you be emailing all the volunteers with sort of a list of locations in the next week or so?
Yeah, as I said, we're gonna be emailing that out, and we'll put it in the blog as well as a kind of routine thing. Oh, and another thing that reminds me of routine things that I put in the blog and email out every March is that if you go to the beach and you don't see any of the target species, please still report that. Negative data is very, very important. We still need to know if you went to Sherwood, or if you went to Short Beach, or if you went to some of the somewhat quieter locations and you didn't see any birds. That's really important to know. And we still want you to go. If later in the season we get to May and there's still no birds, and you say, oh gosh, I want to go somewhere where I can actually see the birds, I can definitely change your site. But we definitely need to know negative data as well. So that's something, again, the next couple of weeks, this is why we do training now, because we have a couple of weeks before we officially start. So we'll be emailing more info out, we'll be putting stuff in the blog. So we'll cover a lot of different topics, but negative data is definitely important. There's a question of, can we enter the beach before it opens with our ID? In most cases, there's really no need for you to be going to beaches that aren't open essentially before a certain time of day. And there's no real capacity to open. Say Stratford doesn't open till a certain hour, very, very early in the morning at Long Beach. Well, there would be nobody there to open it though anyway. Once somebody would be there or the police have come by to open it, it will be open. In other cases, if you can just walk to a certain place, I know some folks walk over to Silver Sands very early because it's just kind of there and walkable, accessible. That's fine too. And another thing is you would not be able to really park anywhere. Just be mindful always to park in, official parking in places where you're permitted to park, because you don't want to get tickets. You don't want to get, towed or anything else. We can't be responsible for that. That's why we take vehicle information for West Haven, because we will have the city submit it. We will submit it to the city, and we will have them mail you a parking pass for the year for free, so you don't have to pay and you won't get ticketed and so forth.
Yep, and that ID that we're sending you, that and $2.50 will get you coffee somewhere. There's no special. It holds no power. It's just identifying what you're doing. So I don't have arrangements with every place that people monitor. So it's more of just identifying what your intentions are at that beach. It doesn't. I don't have the capacity to get you into everywhere. So.
Yeah, and if there's a problem ever, just let us know. It's basically just so that you don't have to pay to get into Stratford. You don't have to pay to get into a random spot somewhere. Or if last year at times we had restricted beaches where no one but residents, and occasionally someone like all of you would be let in with an ID. And if there's a problem, just let us know. There's always I can't even begin to tell you how many times I've been stopped with my ID, and I've had how many years of this. Because people think, like, wait, what are you actually doing? And they don't know, because someone's just manning the lot and they don't have an idea. So it happens, but it's okay. We'll take care of it.
I see your ID there, Beth. You want to? Yeah, that's what it is.
And of course, I looked at it since 2017, but let's see if this,
It's close.
Yeah, so it's basically just identifying you as, a volunteer monitor with Connecticut DEP for piping plovers. There's phone numbers on here, Laura's email. On the back, there's some emergency contact stuff. So it's not, you know, as Laura was saying, a super official thing. But if anyone does give you a hard time, you show them this, you tell them what you're doing, and majority of time, everybody's very receptive. They get it, and you won't have any problems. So I guess just real quick, there have been quite a few questions in the chat, just kind of next steps. Just, I know you guys have said this, just to review, on the website, and Scott will be emailing site lists to everybody, to an email. You know, if you decide on a site you're interested in going to, you email Scott, you can send him all your information, address, vehicle info, if you're thinking about Sandy Point in West Haven or Griswold Point in Old Lyme. And then any other questions can be directed to the ctwaterbirds at gmail.com email. And then also the liability waivers will be, or did we say we're putting those electronically? And then folks can just
They'll be, the liability waivers will be mailed.
Well, no.
Then
I just thought about the logistics of that. I'm going to email it to people. They can print it out.
Okay.
And then snail mail it back to me, or you can take a photo of it and send it to me electronically if you want to be paperless. Because I thought about the logistics of getting that done, and it's probably not going to happen quickly. So probably better to email the PDF to people and have them.
Can people electronically sign if they don't have a printer?
I don't know.
These are great, exciting COVID type questions.
They are.
This is thrilling stuff here.
I did have
quick question.
The badges will be mailed though, yes. The
Yes.
ID, yes.
Yeah, and then we'll lanyard thing.
But yeah, and thank you, Beth, for the summary. Just again, I can't emphasize enough. You have questions, just ctwaterbirds@gmail.com. That's where you go. If you have any questions, you're confused, you get any part of this process, ctwaterbirds@gmail.com will take care of you.
And then there just another question, you know, more folks are you know, talking about sites and things. Your help is needed everywhere, even if we only have one pair of birds, even if, you know, it's one of our busier sites where there's, you know, 20 pairs of plovers and 8 pairs of oystercatchers. Your help's needed everywhere. And the real, you know, you're out there collecting the nesting data and helping us with that, but you're also there, you know, sending a good message to other people at the beach. You know, if we only have one pair of birds, it still makes a difference if, you know, we're tracking if there's dogs, if there's people inside the fencing, and your presence there, being a good steward, sending a good example is really helpful. So, you know, it's your preference what beach you want to go to, somewhere close to your house. If you want to switch sites in the season, you just, you know, email Scott, the Waterbirds, and all of that can be arranged and set up.
You might be done with questions. Looks like the chat's slowing down.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for looking to join us this year, and I hope we'll have all of you with us. It'll be very entertaining and hopefully very successful, following up after a difficult year last year, but everything is getting better in every way conceivably, so we're very optimistic we'll have a great time.
Thank you. Looking forward to a great nesting season ahead.
Yes,
Thanks to your help.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.